And we're back with the program. This is Gerald Glassford from Pop Culture Cosmos and Game Source. We truly appreciate you being part of the broadcast here today. And, well, it's that time again. We're going to recap week 3 in the NFL, some of the highs and some of the lows in this week and in football. And I'll tell you what, there is no better person to do it than my good friend. He is the man, the myth, the legend among all fantasy football pundits, and I'm going to call you a fantasy football pundit per se. There you go. That should put on a business card. I'm a fantasy football pundit. But again, we just truly appreciate it. As always, him coming on the broadcast. It's Tyler Baker of the Fantasy Football Paydirt Podcast. How are you, my friend?
I'm well, my friend, and I would much rather consider myself a student. We're always learning. Football it's always different. I always think of the game of football like the football itself when it hits the ground. When the football hits the ground, you don't know which way it's going to go. And every single week in the NFL, it is something new. We're learning something new. And this week was certainly no exception.
But pundit works better on business cards.
It's way better on the business card.
There you go, indeed. Well, it was another great week in the NFL. A lot more controversial than I would have imagined going into it. But that aside, there were some great things out there for fantasy owners. And the first thing I want to touch on is something that I'm seeing as a trend in the so far this season with one certain team called the Minnesota Vikings. And the reason why I'm saying the Minnesota Vikings is because today Case Keenum had just a truly tremendous day, plus the entire offense as a whole. Big scoring games from both the running back position, the wide receiver position, and the quarterback position. Now, before we get into say, oh yes, Case Keenum is great, what happened to him on the Rams and his history before. I think it's more of a measure of the actual offense of itself, and the offensive coordinator should be more thanked, and the head coaching should be more, in tune as far as with the kudos and whatnot, because if both Sam Bradford and Case Keenum light defenses up like this when their past history suggests that they wouldn't, that tells me something's going on there for fantasy owners that need to start thinking about looking at Minnesota Vikings for their fantasy roster.
Well, what it tells you is that this is a good team, and they were a good team last year, but injuries just stifled that offense with all of the injuries on the offensive line and even some injuries on the defense last year. Well, they're healthy, and they have a guy named Delvin Cook, and he was kind of a missing piece that now that he's in that offense, Adam Thielen has really come on and has presented himself as a real viable option in that offense. So what you have is you have a good team. You have a solid defense that can shut a team like the Tampa Bay Buccaneers down. That is not easy to do. They have a lot of ways. The Buccaneers have a lot of ways that they can move the ball, and that defense is good. And today we saw that offense, even without Sam Bradford, is good. So
I just think it's that scheme, whatever they're running and how they're portraying it as far as a very offensive oriented team. And I just think that scheme of theirs that they have right now, defenses are having a hard time figuring it out.
And a lot of people wrote the Vikings off because Sam Bradford wasn't going to be there. And normally you have the quarterback. That's kind of the stability to an offense. Well, they're running the ball very well. And when you can run the ball well, you can do a lot of things down the field. Play action creates a lot of opportunities down the field. And they have a really good running game now. They have a quarterback that is getting it done. I mean, 369 yards and 3 touchdowns. He didn't take a single sack, no turnovers. That's huge.
What are some of the other things that stuck out to you this weekend? I know Kirk Cousins was a big benefit to me this weekend, but what are some of the other players that stuck out to you as far as for both? Well, let's just start off with the good side first, and those players that really people need to be aware of for future changes and roster makeovers.
Yeah, well, I haven't had a chance to watch all of the games yet, but I will tell you that there's only 2 undefeated teams in the NFL right now, the Atlanta Falcons and the Kansas City Chiefs. The Kansas City Chiefs have Kareem Hunt, and he is so fast. When he gets the ball, he is such a danger. And with the Atlanta Falcons, they have so many weapons on that team. They're 3-0, and they are definitely a team to be reckoned with in the NFC. As far as surprises, Chris Thompson just keeps getting it done in Washington. Very good running back. He's super fast, and they really use him in the passing game and in the running game. In Cincinnati, Joe Mixon, after the change of offensive coordinator, Joe Mixon is finally getting the ball now. The stud.
Well, this is something that you called as well.
Sure. And that can be expected. People, the coaching staff in Cincinnati, they want to keep their jobs, and they have a couple of rookies. John Ross is the first-round rookie wide receiver. He couldn't play today because of injury. I expect when he comes back, he's going to get the ball too. But they need to keep their jobs. And when you watch this running game, Joe Mixon is the best running back that they have. Giovanni Bernard certainly knows the offense better, and probably from a pass-catching point of view, he's probably a little bit better than Mixon, but Mixon is a very good running back. And when you watch this team play, you can tell who the best running back on the field is. And the coaching staff understands that, and they're going to have to get him involved if they want to keep their jobs. The offensive coordinator's already been fired. If the rest of them have any chance of keeping their jobs, they are going to have to get that rookie involved.
Another name that you also pointed out before in our conversations last week was Chris Carson. How did Chris Carson do? Because since even though Seattle didn't fare so well overall in the record-wise, they actually showed some promising signs with Carson, I imagine.
They did. That offense was actually functioning today. And that's something that we really haven't seen. That offensive line is bad, and they're trying to make adjustments. They're trying to get past that. And part of that, especially from a pass rush point of view, is having a decent running game. And Chris Carson, while his numbers weren't great, he has proven that he has to keep defenses a little bit honest, and that they can't just rush everybody at the passer, because Chris Carson is fast enough that he can gain yardage. So he has proven to be so much better than Thomas Rawls or Eddie Lacy or anybody else in that backfield. CJ Prosise is still a good running back, but he's not going to do the things between the tackles that Chris Carson can do. And something else that I saw in that early morning game, if you live on the West Coast, you had to get up at 6:30 in the morning to watch Baltimore and Jacksonville play. But one thing that I noticed is that a former Seahawk, Alex Collins in Baltimore, looked so much better running the ball than Terrence West did. Alex Collins looks a lot faster. It looks like he deals with contact better. So that's somebody going into next week that may be a bigger part of the game plan than Terrence West was this week.
Oh, that's very sound indeed, especially coming over that long flight from England. As far as it's concerned, that's always something to consider there as well. Now, we talked about the good. We talked about the good indeed, but now we got to talk a little bit about the players who didn't quite measure up to what had been expected, and what maybe early on people should start thinking about doing when it comes to their fantasy rosters with some of those players that didn't perform up to standards this weekend.
There were quite a few. There were a couple of offenses that just could not get going, and one of those was the Miami Dolphins. That entire offense was stifled until the fourth quarter. Even the New York-Philadelphia game, both of those offenses were just sputtering along until the fourth quarter. But you have to be concerned about the LA Chargers. Phillip Rivers threw 4 interceptions today. Not all of them I'm going to blame on him, but that's another offense that you expected more out of. But Miami scoring 1 touchdown today and getting beat by the Jets. Now, in my podcast last week, I said that the Jets are not quite as bad as everybody thought, but I didn't think that they were good enough to beat the Dolphins in a divisional matchup, and they did. So you have to be a little bit concerned. I haven't watched that game yet. I'm going to go back and look at the film and try to figure out what was going on there. But Miami at this point is pretty concerning.
Yeah, tell me about it, because I have Jay Ajayi on my roster, and knee issues are very much a concern with him, as we've discussed before on these podcasts, and I'm sure you've discussed it as well on more than one occasion, as I've heard before on your podcast as well. So it definitely for fantasy owners, both him and Jay Cutler have to be of great concern as far as whether or not to keep them as starters at this point.
It's 1 week. It's 1 week. Again, I'm going to go back and I'm going to look at the game film and I'm going to try and see if I can figure out exactly what was going on there. But I mean, 1 week is not everything. It's a grind. And this offense, I'm pretty sure, is going to figure out what's going on. Remember that this is not the quarterback that they started the year with. This is Jay Cutler. They brought him in after there was a preseason injury. So they're probably still figuring each other out as far and where Jay Cutler is familiar with the offense, he's probably not as familiar with his teammates. So again, I'm going to go look at the film and see if I can try to figure out what was going on there. But it was just 1 week. You don't need to go drop these guys. But there's certainly some concern.
Definitely, indeed. Any last thoughts on week 3 in the NFL before we go ahead and make sure everybody knows about all the great things that you do for your fantasy owners out there?
Sure. Well, just buckle up for the ride because this week Houston almost beat New England. I mean, Indianapolis won a game. Chicago beat Pittsburgh. Buffalo beat Denver. So there were some things that happened this week that you just kind of scratch your head. But this evening and all day tomorrow, I'm going to be watching game film, trying to figure it out. Because in watching the game film, the stats are one thing, but the context to the stats, in my opinion, are far more important. So that's what I'm going to be doing tomorrow, is watching these games, trying to see what is really happening, and so that we can be best educated to make the decisions for next week.
Awesome, indeed. And that's going to be, all of his thoughts are going to be relayed. All of his thoughts are going to be relayed out on his podcast on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday on the Fantasy Football Paydirt Podcast. And you can catch it on Libsyn, of course, on Apple Podcasts, Overcast.fm, and Player.fm. And also make sure you check out all the great information that he has on his Facebook group, Fantasy Football Paydirt Podcast on Facebook. He's got a group there. You just go ahead, you join up, and you go ahead, no charge, obviously. It's all free. But the wisdom and voice that he has, he talks to you about trades that's being asked for in your league. He also asks for potential moves. He looks up lineup changes. You can ask him anything you want when it comes to fantasy football. He answers it all, and he does so, and make sure he does so with the best of knowledge and the best of preparation, indeed, because as he said before, he studies all the game film, so he knows what's going down by the middle of the week and the end of the week as it gears towards next Sunday's games. So I'll tell you what, if you haven't gotten on board with the Fantasy Football Paydirt Podcast, it is imperative that you do so as a fantasy owner today. And anything, last thoughts before we head on out?
I'm happy to help people. It's all about making informed decisions, and anybody that wants to put forth an effort, whether to listen to the podcast or just joining the Facebook group, if you have the inclination to be better at fantasy football, I can help you do that.
Oh, that's awesome indeed. And again, that's Tyler Baker from the Fantasy Football Paydirt Podcast. It's now available again, like I said, on Apple Podcasts, Libsyn, Overcast, and Player.fm, and also his great Facebook group, Fantasy Football Paydirt Podcast. Tyler, as always, I truly appreciate you being part of the program, and I look forward to talking with you again at the end of this week about week 4 in the NFL.
Thank you so much. I love being on your show. I love listening to your show. I love all the cool stuff you guys talk about. Thank you for letting me know what's going on with all these games and movies. I need to know this stuff. And sometimes I get too far in my cave of fantasy football that I don't peek out too much. And your show certainly helps me keep in touch with what's going on. Thank you.
Well, no problem. It's great indeed. And wait till you check out the nice theme song we've got for our segments now coming up.
I'm excited.
Indeed. All right. Again, that's Tyler Baker for the Fantasy Football Paydirt Podcast, wrapping up week 3 in the NFL. Tyler, as always, it's great to have you on the Pop Culture Cosmos.